Hey, it's Silas here.
I'm Stephen Kirschner. Welcome back.
We're back again for our this series of "You Are What You Consume." So this is part 5, I think.
Part 5, yes, that's
Yeah.
correct.
So this one we're going to do more of just going to ask him some questions about the cooking field, the cooking industry, and he's been a
Food
part
service
of that.
industry, I guess you'd say.
Food service is probably the term for it. So just going to ask him a few questions, and we're going to also talk about, as you know, this series, "You Are What You Consume." We're building it off the "you are what you eat" kind of saying, and then I'm taking it further to say "you are what you consume" in the fact that you are what you consume both physically through eating and also mentally, which makes up your ideas and your choices in life. Anything else?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, and yeah, there was one thing we had talked about. I think in the last video it mentioned a bit. We were talking about something, and then it came up that about cultural appropriation and stuff, and I was talking about how eating itself is caloric appropriation, taking energy from food and then making that part of your life force and everything. So that's, I think, something we do on a constant basis in different ways. We take things that are already out there that have been created through some process of creation. Created out of creation, yes.
No, this could get into religious versus evolution and all that, but it's something that already exists and you consume it.
Things that you weren't directly responsible for creating, but you go there and you partake in it and you get something out of it and put that into your body and then you make something out of it. Mm-hmm. So, and that's what the food service industry essentially is. Yes. Technically, a lot of other industries are that, but specifically, I think those are the questions I'm going to be trying to get to. And
well, it's interesting too because I've thought about it before with food service about how ultimately, I mean, all sales, all these industries are about figuring out what people want and helping them get it. But with food service, it's a combination of need as well as want. Because you think about it, there are certain luxury items like, you can produce handbags. People don't technically need handbags, but it's a want. But with food, it's like you do need it. Then it just becomes a question of how much do you need? What do you need? How much do you want? What's your spending limit and so on. So I think that's why the food service industry, despite all this automation, despite outsourcing and everything, that's why it's still so prominent because there's always that need there.
Now, I think that's a good question because when we've talked about this in some situations where we say cuisine versus just cooking, because I do think there is a difference with that. Some cultures pretty much just have food. Yeah. And some cultures, I think you'd say a cuisine. Mm. Now, I don't know if we'll discuss that in this exact one, but when does it change from it just being I'm out there shooting an animal and eating it versus food industry? How would you define food industry?
I mean, it's almost like a question of development. Like I feel like if you think about it, you've had these tribes that just worshipped the sun or whatever, but they didn't understand it. But then if you go back to something like ancient Greece, you had Aristotle, who was could be argued was one of the earlier scientists as far as went out and started collecting different samples, started looking for similar characteristics and so on, and started looking for consistencies among them and all that. I watched a presentation on Aristotle recently. That's why I thought about this. Mm-hmm. And I think, but it's a matter of I think it's understanding more what's behind it, developing it, being able to build it further rather than just going with what's there in the moment. Like, for example, you can see a tree, it's wood, but you have to know how to make it into a building for it to be construction or something like that. Maybe that's kind of a crude analogy, but that's something.
Well, I guess probably the industry part of it. Yeah. Being industrial with something versus just being that thing. Besides it just being food. Like if you just go and you pick up an apple from a tree, that's not necessarily food industry. It's this apple from a tree.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Or you pull a fish out of the water and...
Yeah. Okay, so we'll start with this. Okay, how long have you been in the food industry?
So I wanted to actually be a chef since I was about 12 or so. I'm 29 now, for those that don't know. I cooked a bit. I used to work at this retirement home as a teenager. I went to the Culinary Institute of America. I graduated 2009. I came to the city late 2009. I cooked maybe till 2012, 2013, something like that. I'm still very interested in food, obviously, while we're having this conversation, but I knew I didn't want to be a chef because the lifestyle demands the really long hours. I mean, I still enjoy cooking. It's just for what that industry demands, you have to be in love with it. And for me, I have other interests. It was killing me physically. I mean, I was working 70, 80 hours a week. There were some other issues too I had as far as there was a lot of drug use. I saw I didn't like that. There's a lot of substance abuse in general, honestly, including alcohol. I felt like I worked with a lot of people that just wanted to cook and party, and like that whole lifestyle just was never for me. And Anthony Bourdain in Kitchen Confidentially talks a lot about this. Like he talks about sneaking out of work on break to buy drugs and things like that. But like that stuff happens. A lot of people don't work in the industry don't know, but there's a lot of that shady stuff going on. But for me, it's just that whole lifestyle just doesn't appeal to me. I know chefs actually have one of the highest divorce rates too, which isn't surprising either because you're never home. Uh, I think it's the overall lifestyle, the demands, and I think to really be a chef, it's just you have to love cooking, you have to want to do nothing else. Like that is your purpose in life. Whereas for me, I have other interests too, of course. So that's a challenge.
Okay. So one thing I think would be interesting with that is to try to check. Have you tried to see the figures, how they align to, like you said, it was the hours at work. Have you tried to see if those figures also align to similar jobs that have probably similar hours? Because I know there's dentistry apparently has the highest suicide rates.
Oh wow, I didn't know.
I think they do. I'm pretty sure. But then it's kind of now relation with if you find out that something with food now has a high the food industry has a high rate of, I guess, some forms of dysfunctions, addictions.
Well, I think I read something in drug use. I think it was fashion was maybe the highest. I'm not sure. I have to look this up. Construction was up there, and I think food was like 3 or 4. So it's up there, but it's not top.
Okay, these are kind of basic things. Food is, of course, a basic thing. Shelter is a basic thing. Clothing, I'd say when you go more to fashion, it's not necessarily just clothing itself. I'm going to do a video on that. What exactly is the purpose of clothing? Yeah. But I think when it comes to clothing, that goes into the attractiveness, because what you're looking like to the other person. And I think there's also an aspect of clothing where it's supposed to protect your physical reproductive process. That's why shelter is there, to protect your body. Then the eating is there to ensure that your body can be in the best condition possible. And I think all these things tie into life things. So in an extent, fashion is in there. And I'm wondering, with this being around food thing, could it be partially like you're around something that used to, when you're around food, your brain had something in it like activated, you must eat this food, you must partake in this food, or you must be with this food, or there was some trigger sent to you. So if you're in an environment where you're around that food constantly, could there be something where genetically or the way we are, we're being given the constant food, partake, yet you're not hungry, or you can't eat this food? And could there be something in there that's causing some kind of questioning where your body's like, you're getting these signals to do something, yet your overmind or whatever is telling you, no, this is not the time to do it. You're not hungry. You don't need to do this. You can get fired if you do this. So that constant do this can be getting an outlet in other forms of addiction, possibly.
It's part of it. I don't know. I mean, there's often, I guess we shouldn't joke about it, but like someone compared that people work in kitchens to battered women, like the whole, like, they know they have chefs that are screaming at them, telling them they're horrible, but in their own mind, they're like, well, it's okay because I'm working towards a higher level. Again, I don't want to joke about that because that's a really serious problem. But it's almost like that kind of mentality, like, oh, I'm suffering for my art, but that's okay. Like, I feel like there's a bit of that going on. Again, maybe that's issues from childhood. I don't know. Mm-hmm. A lot of the chefs, of course, I worked for, not all. I worked for some very good ones, but some of them, they're really bullies. And as I myself have started delving more into psychology, philosophy, self-knowledge, like you spend time around these people and you realize that they have a lot of anxiety issues. You realize that they have to drink to open up about certain things. You realize that some of them are kind of socially awkward when they're not running the kitchen. You can just see there's some deeply seated anxiety issue. So I think that factors into it as well. Again, I'm sure it varies based on the individual, but I get that kind of impression that there's some, in a lot of these people, there's some deeply seated issues that they haven't resolved. And just even the fact that they go out and get drunk, many of them go out and get drunk every night,
Because here in New York, we have that kind of perception where people in the finance industry are sort of in this same situation, where it's like, yes, we're out there. I think cocaine is normally associated with the people in the finance industry, or just going out. You go to bars and you'd be here at a bar late. I haven't frequented the bars in a while, but sometimes you'd be out late and somebody would come in, they'd be dressed in full suits, and if you end up talking to them, they've just come from the office and they've just made like $1 million moves, and then now all of a sudden they're in this situation where it's a strange thing. So I'm trying to wonder, I think it would be interesting to try and see, is it something about the food industry, or is this something that, due to your familiarity with it, you have actually had these people open up and show you these things about them, yet these things exist? more across other fields as well.
And I was going to say that's kind of hard for me to say because I've worked pretty much in food service industry. Like most of my friends have work or have worked in restaurants. Obviously, a few exceptions like Silas, who I met through Meetup and so on. But in general, because I've been in the industry pretty much my whole working life, that's the only side I've seen. So I can't speak for other fields. But I mean, I'm sure these problems exist in other fields. We just don't hear as much about them. I just think with food service, the problem is people watch the Food Network and everything, and they think, oh, that looks fun. That looks like a fun career and all that. But they don't know what really goes on behind the scenes.
I think that's another question I was going to ask you was why this field? I mean, with the cooking thing, we can probably talk about that, why people cook and why some choose not to. But why enter the field? Why do you think most people enter? And then what do you think are a few of the things that surprise people the most that you think people should know about? Let's say somebody says, I want to join a restaurant and be either a server or is that front?
Front of house.
Front of house versus back of house.
Yes.
And just start talking about why you think people join it. Why do you think gets people to go to this? And then what do you think are a few things people should know before they enter?
See, I think it depends on the person. Like, I know people who just said they've just wanted to cook forever. They've told me that's literally all they've wanted to do. I remember I had a chef like that when I told him I didn't want to cook anymore. He was kind of surprised because he's like, oh, you seem really interested in this. I'm surprised. And I explained, look, I like doing this, but I don't love it. I have other interests, plus all of the things we talked about. This just isn't for me career-wise. And I asked him, I said, well, if you didn't cook, what else would you do? He's like, I don't know. This is all I've wanted to do. So I think there is that crowd. Those are the people who stick with it. Other people who had kind of thought about it but ended up in it by accident. Thomas Keller is actually an interesting case. For those who saw our last video, I'm talking about Thomas Keller, the chef. He actually didn't start cooking professionally until he was 19 or so, which is considered later. Because the thing is, in France, a lot of these guys start at 13, 14. And he actually said he didn't know what he wanted to do. He was considering carpentry. He was kind of lost. But he just got into cooking and he excelled at it and he just kept going with it. So I think there are those stories too, like other people who have other careers and they get into cooking because it might appeal to them for a variety of reasons. Maybe they like to cook at home and they just wanted to take it further. They just love food. There could be various reasons depending on the person, but then they find out, wow, this is really where I belong, and then they excel at it.
And for you personally, you said you wanted to cook since you were a kid. Like for me, I've just been cooking. We used to cook a couple of meals a week for my family. We used to have this thing, our mom just taught us how to cook while we were growing up. And
right.
A few days out of the week, some of my siblings would be in charge of making food that day. Our mom would help, and we'd get old enough and capable enough to do it ourselves. So I imagine you still cook occasionally, right?
Yeah,
so
usually holidays and everything.
Cooking. Yeah. You still like cooking. So what made you decide, okay, this is a profession, and what other things were you thinking about? Like what kind of information do you think? I know these things don't happen on one thing. It's kind of
it's a series.
Gradually head to somewhere, then something happens. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna take this dive. But what are a few of the things that you think were like, okay, when you heard this, you're like, okay, maybe I can try this. Maybe I can actually make a profession out of this.
Well, again, I think I liked cooking growing up. I mean, my mother cooked a bit. My dad does sometimes too. My grandmother's, of course. I wasn't very good in school. I mean, in retrospect, I love learning, of course, but the problem. I think looking back on it all now, there were a lot of problems with the system. I mean, that's a long discussion in of itself. But I think because I was in an environment in school the way it was where I didn't do well, I thought, oh, maybe I'm not suited to academic stuff. Maybe I should do more of a blue-collar thing. And I just enjoyed cooking, so that's why I decided to pursue that. But I think in retrospect, no, I do have a deep love of learning. I just have to be in the right environment. I think everyone, and I think this applies to everyone kind of has to figure out their own learning style. Like, how do I learn things? Do I learn better through listening or reading? Do I learn better from discussing, a combination? And I think one of many, many problems with the school system is it's just this one size fits all rather than looking at the individual person and thinking, how do we respond to this person's needs and desires?
Okay, and what are a few things you think could get people to recoil from people who are entering the industry who have a passion for it, who are saying, okay, this is something I want. And then that whole thing, people like sausage, but they don't want to see how the sausage is made. So what do you think is something like that where they'll get in and they're like, wow, this is actually not that good, that you feel people should be aware of so they can maybe overcome, because it's something that shouldn't necessarily make you not want to be part of it?
Well, I would start off by saying that if you're considering cooking, what I would recommend doing is first just work in a kitchen. Don't go to culinary school, because the problem is culinary school, like a lot of schools now, like are not accurate representations of the real world. And the problem with that is people go to school, think, oh, this is fun, and they get into a real world kitchen and they see, wow, this is nothing like I expected. So, and then of course you have all this debt you got to pay off, and it's just for a career you don't even do anymore. So what I would recommend is, if you're serious, just consider working in a kitchen, see if you can get a job even in like a diner or something, but just sort of see, okay, how does a kitchen function? And then, do I like this type of work? Am I able to do it? Do I want to possibly take it to a higher end level, and so on? And I think for a lot of people, it's just, I mean, what makes it so hard for everyone, I think it's the physical demands. You're on your feet all day. Of course, it's physical, chopping and everything. The hours, like, there's this restaurant, Avoce, it's in the Time Warner building near Columbus Circle. The chef de cuisine, that's like the number 2 guy, works baseline 90 hours a week. Holidays, it's closer to 100. So it's like, are you able to do that? Can you do that? Do you love this enough you're able to do that? You got to ask those questions too. Because again, other jobs, they have the hours too. I mean, you look at somebody who is a CEO, yeah, they work 70, 80 hours a week to get where they are,
Yeah.
but they're willing to sacrifice other things because to them getting that position is that important. But you have to ask, are you willing to make that sacrifice? Do you love this career enough you're willing to do that?
And I think I want to add to that is, when you're talking about these 90 to 100 hour weeks, it's a different situation if it's your own business.
Yeah.
If you start a business, those are the hours you're looking at putting in most cases, at least definitely for the first couple of years as the business goes up. So are you willing to put in hours that you put for running your own business for working for somebody else's business? So I think that would be something that's kind of interesting to think of.
And people, I think some of like the better managers and chefs have told me they treat the place they work like it was their business. Obviously, they can't make the decisions, but they take it that seriously because it's like, look, I want this place to do well. I want this place to make money. Obviously, their livelihood depends on that. And it's just general work ethic. It's, look, I want to do the best I can and take pride in where I work.
What are a few occasions or things that made you... Okay, you said you decided to stop the actual cooking part of the...
Professionally, yeah.
What was it again? Front end and then the
back of house.
The back of house. What was a few things that happened that made you think, okay, maybe this is not something? Was this the hours or what?
It was a number of things. I mean, I think it was, again, a lot of the people I worked with, not all. I mean, I worked for a few chefs that I felt inspired by, but other chefs were just kind of bullies, kind of immature. Again, a lot of substance problems. I think a lot of the work, I actually found myself very bored with it. Like, I like the creativity aspect of it, but a lot of the work just becomes manual, repetitive labor, and I think I got really like bored of doing that, and I had trouble staying focused. Because people don't realize, like, you're cutting, a Cambro, like a large container of onions, like, you just sit there and you'll just do that for 20 minutes. I remember one place I used to work, you had to squeeze out maybe, like 20 pounds or something of spinach. Like, you just had to squeeze water. Like, it's work. It's a lot of tedious stuff. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, for me, I have a very active mind. So for me, it's hard to stay focused on the tedious, repetitious tasks. That's part of it. Again, the hours, I mean, I have other interests, obviously, politics, philosophy, economics, history, those things. And it's like, you can't pursue any of that when you're spending 80 hours a week in a kitchen. So for me, it was just sort of a coalescence of all those things. It wasn't one or two factors. I think it was just overall. And I don't know. I think maybe I've changed too. I mean, I'm not the same person I was at 12, certainly. I don't think I'm probably not even the same person I was 2-3 years ago. So yeah. It's just like, it's hard to say, like, when I talk about my past self, I often feel like I'm comparing two different people. Yeah.
I'm wondering, the mundane, repetitive thing, I think that would be something to look into with the other jobs that do, that have that kind of situation where
you're just doing that same task.
Yeah. But then I think, okay, well, another thing I was trying to think of here was, when you have this situation where you're doing these mundane, repetitive things, and especially when it's in something, as I mentioned before, food, of course, is, if people don't have a drive to eat, you're probably not going to make it that far in life. So you have that drive. And there's this thing where people say they work in a certain field or they do a certain thing and then they don't like that thing. It's like, I remember my brother had a job at Baskin-Robbins in high school and he just stopped liking ice cream. I mean, he never really liked sugary things, I think, to begin with. But there's that whole thing, like, if you work in pizza industry, you will stop eating pizza that much. Could there be a possible, I'm wondering if there's another negative thing, if you're in this mundane action, this behavior with foods, again, that same drive that's supposed to be positive of making you want to eat, you're tying in the urges of wanting to eat every time you're exposed to food, then you tie in the whole aspect of becoming not as not as familiar, not having as much pleasure or instinct for something that you're supposed to like, then you start to dislike food, and then you see the way people react to food. You get in a society where people are abusing food, as we discussed, with like obesity issues and stuff like that. And it's just, I can imagine that can be rather taxing mentally for some people.
Well, I was thinking too recently on our first video, we put up a picture of a pate from Barbalud where I used to work, and I had dinner that night. When I used to work there, I was so sick of charcuterie, the pates, terrines, and everything, because I prepared or I was snacking on them all the time. Mm-hmm. So I remember I saw them on any other restaurant after that for the next few years. I was like, no, I'm not touching this. but then it was, time passed. I'm like, okay, I'll eat this again. But, it's because I saw those just in front of me all the time. It's like, no, I don't have an interest now. And it's funny, a friend of mine who works where I work, he was saying one night how like he'll never get sushi on his days off because it's just like you see it around you all day, every day. Sometimes eating it, it's like it's the last thing I want to try.
Yeah. Okay. What is the kind of food where you'd say it's better to save this for the top quality? I mean, there's some situations where you can get a bargain version of it where you think, okay, it's not really that big of a difference. But in some situations, are there certain things, food experiences, dining experiences that you think, if you have like a buffet, all you can eat $10 version of it, avoid that. If you see that on the
like sushi,
place. Yeah,
quality.
just had a friend talk about that. Like he had some issues with sushi. But yes, what are some kind of foods that you think it's better to save up and have it once a year versus getting the bargain version of it every month?
I mean, I think it's restaurants in general, like something like the French Laundry or Per Se. Like, I would love to do something like that, but again, that's something you do rarely. I mean, even if you have the money, it's like you're not going to go there every weekend. It's just you're not going to sit down for 5 hours and have 20 courses. But again, that also depends how much money. I mean, maybe special occasion or something. Like, let's say you get a big promotion or something, maybe you would go there to sort of celebrate. Yeah. But it's not like, every Friday I'm going to go to Per Se. I mean, I had a friend who worked at Alinea, which is a top restaurant in Chicago, and he said their so-called regulars were there, I think, like twice a year maximum.
Actually, when did your friend work there? Because I had a good friend from high school. We were good friends in high school, and she worked there, front of the.
It was a few front of the house, yeah.
Front of the house.
It was a few.
She was in Chicago there, so small world. They probably know each other.
Because it was a few years ago. I'm trying to think because I worked with this guy I'm referring to maybe like 3 years ago, and then he came. Maybe like he was there maybe 2-3 years before that, so I'm not.
Yeah, that's kind of around the time.
Yeah, maybe they were. Yeah,
check it out.
Cross paths.
Check it. That's pretty awesome. Yeah. But yeah, small world. I have this saying, like they say, it's a small world, but the good news. I like to add that it's a small world, but the good news is enough room for all of us. Because there's things that keep happening where you find out, this person is there. And now, speaking about the world, I think it's a good transition into this. Right now in United States politics, of course, some issues with Donald J. Trump, and he's some just a few, just a smidge. So he's actually doing this thing where there's this DACA Act, I don't know the actual term for it.
Dream Act, I don't know.
Something to do with people that came here illegally into the country, and then they had children here, or they brought in young children, and then there was this executive order by the former President Obama to kind of allow them to stay in the country and get amnesty from being deported because they technically are illegal, and the punishment for that under the law is deportation. So anyway, but there's a lot of things that comes up. I've been to some political events, and I'm sure this has come up often, where people say, who's going to work these jobs? Who's going to work certain jobs? In food industry now we're talking about who's going to pick the plants. I mean, who's going to pick the produce? Who's going to work on the farms? Then when it comes to the kitchens as well, people are going to say, who's going to work these restaurants? And that's something, two-part question on this. How important, have you found any correlation, I probably know the answer to this, most of you probably know the answer to this, to somebody being of a certain ethnicity and being able to cook the cuisine of that food, of that country, and also just how many, okay, I don't know if this is like, you can talk about this, but how many people, in your opinion, are the cooks in restaurants and things actually this vast cabal of illegal immigrants that people think if they got deported, all of a sudden restaurants would be out of people?
It's kind of a mix. It's hard to say because, I mean, I've worked in kitchens. Like, there are kitchens where it's, like, pretty much all people from, like, Central and South America. But then a lot of places I worked, it was kind of a mix. Like, you had some American people who went to culinary school. You had some people either from certain African countries like Gambia or Ghana. And then you had some people from the Caribbean. It was kind of a mix. I mean, I think part of the issue recently has just become, this was another topic I was going to get into with the industry, is people don't realize like how little cooks make, like especially here in the city. I mean, you're cooking, you're making almost minimum wage. It's like, and you think about how expensive a place like New York is to live in, it's like you can barely pay your bills on time. I mean, that's what I was doing for a few years. But then because of that, it's harder to find Americans who want to work, because this, it's a stereotype, but it's true. But like a lot of Americans are going to want 20 or more an hour, health benefits, all that. And it's like the majority of restaurants are not going to give you that. It either has to be a hotel or some big company where they're able to provide that. So, but if somebody comes from the third world and then they're being able to work in a kitchen, it's vastly better. Even if they live in some poor part of the Bronx, work for minimum wage, it's still better off than their situation back home. So they're willing to do that because you can look and you might say, oh, that's horrible, and a lot of Americans would, but it might be their best situation given their circumstances. It's the whole thing that comes up a lot with sweatshops and everything, that people think, oh my God, that's horrible. And yeah, compared to what we're used to, it is. But if you look at what they have back home, it's either subsistence farming, prostitution, crime, all those things. So working in a factory is almost a godsend by comparison. Yeah. Again, not compared to a perfect situation, no. But I mean, given their situation, it's a better option.
I feel like they're probably even going to change that term, sweatshops, because you have like hot yoga where people pay to sweat here now. It's like it's like, oh yeah, you're getting paid to sweat here. It's like, hey, we'll pay you. People will pay pretty much, one person will pay as much for a hot yoga session. That's like an hour and a half.
I don't know.
That would probably pay the salary for like 100 people a day in a sweatshop in a developing country. Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of interesting to think of those two different expectations. But we were asking, like, okay, how many do you think actually are? Is it really that many? I guess if you're not really going around telling people. Well,
but it also depends on the place too. Like a lot of the smaller companies or smaller restaurants will find ways to slip things under the radar. For example, when the Department of Labor people come in, they'll send the people away. Like I worked with a bunch of Filipinos who were here illegally. That happened with them too. I knew one guy actually. What he did was he came here on a visa. I guess he worked for Marriott, but he stayed here when his visa expired, and he just went like working in different restaurants. So you have situations like that. I know there was one guy who got deported like 3 times but kept coming back. Wow. There's all sorts of stuff like that, but then he
kept coming back and was rehired at the same position.
No, it was just to get into the country in general. But he told this guy we worked with that.
Okay.
I knew a Colombian guy who came here illegally but married an American woman to get citizenship. You see situations like that. I actually had this Bulgarian friend who was trying to get me to marry one of his friends just so she could get papers. I'm like, no, I'm not going to get mixed up in all this. But there are situations like that, because I know there are a lot of people who are here illegally from obviously Central and South America, but also a lot from Nigeria. There are a lot from Russia and Eastern Europe in general. There are the Philippines. Yeah, I mean, it's not just because a lot of people think illegal immigrant, they think Mexico or around there, but they're really from all over, though.
Yeah. All right, 1 second. I'm going to turn off my phone. Yeah, back in. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So again, people say illegal. It could be from all over these different places, and I know that there are different ways. People have gotten here in different ways, too, of course. There's for example, there are even people from the Middle East. I've heard those stories about people who will shave their beards and sneak in with Mexicans, but because the skin tone is similar, people don't see that right away. And of course, not everyone who comes in through Mexico is Mexican either. I mean, people from Guatemala or further south will come up through those countries. There was actually a movie about that. I don't know if it was made in Mexico or where, but it was about these trains that carry these people up through Central America, through Guatemala, through Mexico up to the U.S., and just all the stuff that goes on there. The trains are the equivalent of shanty towns, and there are gangs on them, and the gangs try to prey on it. It gets really ugly, all the stuff that goes on.
Okay, now when it goes to the type of cooking, because as you see here, different people cook in different places. I'm sure there's a level of authenticity somebody might feel if they go to, let's say, a Japanese restaurant and see the head chef being someone from Japan. If they hear people speaking Japanese, they might feel, there might be an extra sense of that. But when it comes down to it, a lot of these things can be taught. People can learn these different styles of cooking. And so that's the thing. You can learn different styles of cooking, and you can eat different styles of foods. But I also do think there are certain foods, this whole thing with this diet that I was thinking, instead of this paleo diet or whatnot, think that you are what you eat. There should be an ancestral diet where you go back and you see, what did my ancestors eat? And if you can find out what your ancestors ate before there was modern forms of exercise, modern forms of medication, where they were just pretty much dealing. Actually, food is a sort of medication in and of itself. It's actually just medicating the condition of constantly dying, which is the name of my channel, Dying Alive. Like, you're constantly dying and you take food to cure you of death. So,
well, I didn't know this until recently, but they say like the reason we crave sugar is that our ancestors craved fruit because it was a source of carbohydrates.
Yeah.
It's just technology allows us to extract those sugars out so that getting more sugar gives that sugar high, that dopamine hit, but that the reason for that is because the body thinks, wow, I really like this, I need this for energy.
Yeah.
But of course the problem was we didn't evolve to have sugar that way. Our technology has given us the ability to do that. It's the same thing with fat heavy food. Like in the past, you ate fat heavy food because, you know, your body, your ancestors' bodies thought, oh good, now this will help store energy for the winter or whatever. But then now, of course, you can fry stuff, you can have stuff cooked in lard and all that. So that's why it's very satisfying to eat fatty food.
That dopamine thing is the thing I was talking about. It's
Yeah.
like, one of the foods for me is like popcorn. You know, it's like you could just have eaten a whole bowl of popcorn. Although popcorn's a really cool food because you take like maybe a handful of it and you get a full bowl from it.
Yeah.
But even if you just eaten a whole lot of popcorn, a whole mess of popcorn, if you smell popcorn, you're going to want more popcorn. So I was kind of thinking with that whole thing that you see with the sugars, but also with the foods when you're working there. You could have just eaten, but you had this really good steak, and then you walk in and you see another steak, you're like, oh my God, that dopamine gets triggered and can be causing people's imbalances. But what I was saying with the ancestral diet, certain foods, certain people break down better. I think I don't know if I actually read something about this, but Asian people break down, at least Japanese people specifically, and Southeast Asian people. So they're talking about Japanese, Koreans, and Chinese. They break down rice in a different way, and I think that's also part of how it was selected in their genetics. Just the same way how alcohol, when Native Americans, they didn't have alcohol in their cultures, so they had a different reaction to it. So this is something that, it takes a while for certain physiologies to adjust to certain foods. This allergy, somebody can eat a peanut and die from that. Most people eat peanuts and are okay. But you can learn these things. You can learn to eat things. Your body does take things in a different way. So when it comes down to learning different cuisines, can you also learn different kinds of thoughts, different kinds of ideas? And I do think there probably is something with people's physiologies that gets them to react to certain cultures, certain structures, certain ideas about how people interact, about how to react to certain situations that can also be learned, and then some other people could be kind of allergic to. What are your thoughts on that?
What, just in food or with ideas?
I mean, just with the whole what you consume, you know, being able to learn how to eat something else, because...
Well, I think some of it too, it's, we talked about this a bit in the Keller video, how he talks, there's that line where he even says, I want my food to evoke memories. And if you think about it, that's why he has those old school dishes in new presentations, because he wants to sort of play both sides of it as far as, you know, bringing back that memory, like in the scene from Ratatouille, the critic thinking of eating Ratatouille when he was a kid. But, you know, it's nice to have that sort of nostalgia, but at the same time, it's done in a way that's new and it's more creative. So, like, the current you can appreciate this more developed food, but at the same time, there is that sort of nostalgia for, like, wow, I remember what this was like. Like, my parents have said this, like, you know, when you're a little kid, you remember how Christmas, how magical it seems and all that. Then you reach a certain age, you get past that. But when you're an adult, you start getting that feeling back because you see your kids being happy on Christmas Day, and that brings back feelings from when you were a kid and you went through the same thing. So I think it's kind of like that.
Because there is that, because there's a whole thing, like, people will understand, like, I think we mentioned this before in the video, but if you go, like right now, the area you live in, there's a lot of Indian restaurants in this area. If you walk into a place and you see an Indian restaurant and it's full of people who look like they're from the Indian country, like, you wouldn't be surprised. You'd be like, okay, this is common. This is kind of, they would gravitate to foods from the culture that they're in. But then when it comes to the point where you say somebody has come from a certain culture, and even when they move here, they may gravitate to people that vote in a certain way, that interact in a certain way, that have practice in a certain way, that couple in a certain way. And you see this a lot. I think in high school we had a situation where you're in high school together, we're all eating in different lunchrooms, but people gravitate to certain tables. Or post-high school, when it gets to the point of starting relationships, getting marriages, they go back more to their cultural roots, if there's no better term for it.
Or they might even rebel against it if they have issues with it. Like, I knew this, I worked with this girl who was Korean, and she was born here, but her parents were from there. But she talked about how her parents wanted her to marry only a Korean guy, and like she actually was married for a time, and he was the kind of guy who was like perfect on paper, like, you know, top marks in school, made good money, good looking, all that, but she wasn't attracted to him. But the thing was, she had to divorce him because she wasn't happy. But she had a lot of issues with Korean culture herself, despite the fact that her parents were from there. So she rebelled against all that as a reaction. Whereas I think other people, okay, I think it's either you were just sort of told go along with this and you just do rather than questioning it, or the alternative is those values are just comfortable to you, so you go along with them. I think, but that's more of your own volition, depending on what. I mean, obviously, you're in an arranged marriage; you don't have a say in that. But it's, well, that's what our family has done for centuries. This is what we have to do. But then other people might marry, like you say, their own people of their own background or something, just because they're comfortable. They know the values. Their values are similar. You know, maybe certain traits that are valued in one culture. Certain traits are valued in a culture, so they look for a partner who values those traits, things like that. So it's that certain familiarity.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to try to talk about that, because that's one of the things I was wondering with when does a food become Americanized? Because a lot of the foods were developed by people that came from other cultures, and they came here and adjusted it. Even in those cultures before, some things that we might consider part of French cuisine could have been brought over by Gauls who came from somewhere else before France was France, and that's kind of...
Yeah, the Phoenicians brought all this stuff to...
As I've mentioned, like right now, if you go to a Kenyan restaurant, you will find chapati in there, and chapati is something that was brought over by the Indians, which is, I think, a modified version of roti. It's this flat bread. Roti or naan, which people I think are more familiar with here in America. But so yeah, that process of the cultural sharing, and there's something in Kenya that they do where whenever you enter somebody's house, like I haven't done that, it brings proof that I'm not that Kenyan. But whenever you go into somebody's house, if you're sitting down even for a bit, they will offer you like mkate na chai, which is just tea and bread. It's normally you offer them something to eat, and it's normally like a cup of tea. And that tea, even though Kenya did produce, I need to double check this. I don't know if Kenyans were drinking tea that much before it was colonized by the United Kingdom, but there's this whole thing where now tea is a part of the culture. It's part of the thing that when you go different tribes, different locations, they normally give you something to drink. And it's a kind of common thing. Yet one thing I've noticed, maybe it's from different kind of cultures here in America, it's not as usual. It's not really considered that rude if somebody comes over to your house and it's not around a mealtime and you don't really offer them something to eat.
No, it's more. That's basically it. Like if I go to someone's house and they offer something that's nice and I say thank you or whatever, but it's not expected. Oh, I go into their house and they give me something. That's been my experience. And again, I had friends growing up who their parents said, "Oh, offer your friend a drink or something," but it wasn't. I grew up not to the way I was raised. My parents are always like, don't expect handouts. It's not like just because you walk in there you're owed something. It's like if they want to do it out of their generosity, fine. And I've tried to have that mentality too about a lot of different things. Like if somebody wants to give me something, sure, but it's not like I'm owed something just because I walk into their building.
Actually, I'd be interested. If you guys can comment below about that. If you guys have growing up, or if you personally have the thing where you feel there's a need to kind of give food to pretty much anyone that's in your house for like over 30 minutes. Let me know if you guys had that experience or had parents that did that in that way. Because I'm thinking there could be an aspect of it where you have some of the more developing cultures that are still, I don't want to say pre-industrial, but still have people that...
They're working their way towards,
where they might have grown up, like I know with my parents, they grew up in the village, and I guess in that kind of situation, if somebody's coming over to your house, chances are they were walking a couple of miles to get to your home, and then they would have to walk back. So maybe if somebody knows this person just got in their car and we're sitting down for 30 minutes and they drove over here and didn't expend any energy, I don't really have to like re-up their energy. You know what I mean?
Well, like I was reading recently too. There's a thing that some Korean mother-in-laws will actually do where they'll go to the son-in-law's house and they'll actually just start cleaning up, start rearranging things. And the thing is, you do that to a lot of Americans, that's seen as rude because it's like, wait, that's my stuff. What are you doing? But in that culture, that's seen as, well, I'm tidying up their house. That's doing them a favor, and because I'm like their second mother, I should be responsible.
Yeah.
So it's that different value system. Whereas in one culture, it's like, what's wrong with you? This is my stuff. The other culture, it's, well, I'm doing you a favor because I care about you. So
yeah. So I think probably going to wind it down here, but I think some takeaways from this is this. The familiarity we have with food, and I know a lot of people say part of why it's good to have different cultures is their foods, and I find that to be a bit disingenuous because in many cases, that food you're getting is not necessarily being made directly by the people in that culture. But I think one cool thing to do would be possibly the next time you feel like eating some food from a different culture that you feel is a different culture from yours, maybe just try to understand, okay, what is the history behind this food? How was this food made? Why is it called this? If it has a name that's in a different language, maybe try to see what that name's about or how it was developed. And I think that's part of why I'm interested in the series.
I mean, even the etymology of words in general changed. Like I was reading recently that I was reading about sophistry. Sophistry, for those who don't know, that's basically it's basically telling a lie, but in a way that's convincing from an argumentation standpoint. And but the word sophist comes from, I think it's sophos in Greek, which actually means wisdom. And the thing is, that's also where the word sophomore comes from. That's where the word sophisticated comes from, and so on. But the thing is, sophisticated used to actually mean to make something more complex, but in a way that would adulterate it. For example, putting water in a whiskey, watering down, just watering things down in general. But the thing, of course, say you hear sophisticated, you think complicated. So like the meanings of those words changed over time too. So that's the other thing. You might even use, like for example, my last name Kirschner. It's actually Kirschner. It's actually an Austrian dialect, but it's a region called Silesia, which is mostly in Poland today. And Kirsch in Hochdeutsch, the standard German, means cherry, but in this dialect it actually means furrier. It's someone who works with fur or leather. Mm-hmm. So it's like there are things like that too, where the words sound similar, but it could have a different etymological root. So
yeah. So I think that's a good thing to think of, because you'll probably realize that a lot of getting food was a main aspect of how we developed the civilizations and cultures that we had. Because if you couldn't eat, if you didn't have energy, you wouldn't be able to do anything else. So
a lot of revolutions started because either food supplies ran out or because food became unaffordable due to monetary issues or other things.
Even more recently, it could be related. Food seems to, it's a common thing. It pops in. The Arab Spring was initiated. The first major spark of it was, I think in Tunisia, there was somebody with a food cart. The police came and they knocked his food cart over, and then he decided to immolate himself and to set himself on fire. And that was, I think, was the first major point of the Arab Spring. And
well, two major things that I just thought of. One is the French Revolution. There's the famous "Let them eat cake" line. There was that, and also a lot of people don't know. Around the end of World War II, there was this massive starvation in India. And apparently more Indians died in that than Jews died in the Holocaust. Like, a lot of people don't know that because that's been sort of downplayed. But that was one of the things that helped prompt people like Gandhi to take action, because it's like, look, my people are dying in mass numbers. Something has to change.
Then you also have something like the Boston Tea Party. I know it wasn't directly about tea, but that's a big thing in American history, and that's tea's involved. So I think with this series...
Taxes on sugar, too, though. I mean, that's...
Yeah. And with this series, I think we'll start venturing more into consumption, just talking about different ways of consumption, because I think if you understand why, you can learn a lot from the process of why people have certain foods, and you can understand why certain cultures developed in certain ways. And I think that's tied in a lot to the foods they eat, to how they had to get the resources, how they had to get the foods that they have. Like a simple thing, like why do you think so many cities are around rivers and waterways? It's all this land, but it's not all this land. 75% of the world is water, but a lot of cities and major cities are by the coast or by
New Orleans. It's built below sea level on a swamp, basically.
Yeah. There was this the hurricane that happened in Texas. I just saw something about how they said something like 80% of the world or something lives by major waterways, so by the coast and that. So why were they doing that? Well, fishing, access
farming.
To the rivers, farming. So you had to be by this. And I think you can see something with certain cultures. I think the next topic might be this, about how that food knowledge, that awareness of how things are cooked. People who are still have these very cultural ways of doing it. Not only was it people would be together in the house cooking, it would be a connection between parents and children, spending time both getting the resources, prepping the food, cooking the food, eating the food. It was a whole different process that kind of bonded people together in a different way. Then when you have cultures where it goes away from that, where you're outsourcing that, you're spending so much time doing other things, you just go to a restaurant, get your food, or get your food delivered. Does that break apart the people? By them not having that knowledge of how their food is prepared or what they're eating, does it...
Well, I think that could be applied to technology in general. Like, they talk about, like, talking to people over Facebook versus conversations like this, how, in a way, the brain does perceive it somewhat similarly, but there is sort of that missing connection as well. And they've said that, of course, in the terms of romantic relationships, there are things like, the bodies will actually pick up each other's pheromones. And like, there are things that are happening at a subconscious or even physiological level that people aren't thinking about. But in terms of evolution, we evolved to need those things. But technology, because it's made it easier, people can work around that or think, I'm just going to have food sent to my house rather than take the time to cook it. I'm going to I'm just going to look at women online rather than going out and meeting a woman, because it's just it's made it easier for that instant gratification. Whereas in the past, you had to do those things. Yeah. You had to develop yourself to be a good mate, and then you had to become more attractive. You had to go out, actually hunt the animal. So you had to do all these things. But technology has made a lot of that unnecessary. But then the problem is that's created another series of problems.
Yeah. So yeah, well, that's going to be it for now. If you guys have any other suggestions or questions that you guys think might be interesting,
feel free to suggest show topics. I mean, I'm always
definitely willing to take those. And we'll be back probably next week for another one. And that's it from me.
That's
Silas.
all. Yeah.
Okay.
Hope you enjoyed. See you soon.
Goodbye.